The Sine Institute of Policy and Politics is American University's incubator for policy innovation. We convene leaders in the academic, public, private, nonprofit, and journalism sectors to engage and promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. In an evolving world, we seize the opportunity to work on the nation's most pressing challenges through collaboration by experts and top scholars in their field with students in research and scholarship. As part of that goal, the Sine Institute leverages American University's location in our nation's capital, the nexus of government and a growing international business center. We connect diverse perspectives from around the country and around the world with our world-class academics and research, experienced practitioners, and the most politically active student body in the U.S. We stand apart through our focus on the role of business and the nonprofit community in public policy, the rise of the importance of economic regions in the United States, and international policy issues. Our focus is to make an immediate impact at the intersection of policy and politics that leads to real and lasting change. Thank you for joining us as we convene, communicate, and collaborate. And now introducing 2023 Sine Fellow, the Honorable Doug Ducey.
Hello, everyone. It's so good to see everyone. I see some familiar faces from our earlier seminar today. And I hope after this one, we can all take a little field trip down to the other seminar that will start at 5. So welcome to our Sine Institute's Fellow Seminar today. My name is Ava Gadden, and I'm the Administrative Assistant for Sine. On behalf of the Sine Institute and myself, we are so pleased that you have chosen to join us for this event. The Sine Institute is a laboratory for university-wide collaboration and an incubator for policy innovation, convening the best and brightest in the public, private, academic, and nonprofit sectors, as well as journalism. The Institute is where the brightest minds engage to promote common ground and nonpartisan solutions. It is where American University comes to convene, communicate, and collaborate. Tonight, we are honored to have our fellow, Honorable Doug Ducey, and his featured guest, Shoshana Weissmann, joining us. Governor Thank you, was elected as Arizona's 23rd governor in 2014 and re-elected in 2018 with more votes than anyone in state history. While in office, Governor Ducey prioritized education and reforming the state's economy. He also spent some of his term as governor serving as the chairman of the Republican Governors Association. Governor Ducey is a former businessman, previously serving as the CEO of Cold Stone Creamery. His guest, Shoshana Weissmann, is the Digital Director and Policy Fellow at the R Street Institute, which is a nonprofit, nonpartisan public policy research organization. She manages R Street's social media, email marketing, and other digital assets. Shoshana is also on the board of the Conservation Coalition and a member of the Federalist Society's Regulatory Transparency Project State and Local Working Group. Governor Ducey has joined us on campus to share his experiences with bringing innovation and an entrepreneurial approach to state government. Through this issue, he will help us navigate how the sectors come together to make real change. Please welcome Governor Doug Ducey and Shoshana Weissmann.
Thank you, Ava. Thank you, everyone, for being here today. It's good to see everyone. It's great to be back on campus as well. I invited Shoshana to interview me today, and I wanted to introduce her to you as someone that I didn't know when I ran for governor. She was someone that I was, when I ran, familiar with because she would advocate for policies she believed in online, and she was very effective at it. And my team began to take notice of some of the things that she was doing. I didn't know what R Street was at the time. I was really just getting started with my first term. But over the course of the 8 years that I was in office, I think you came out to visit several times. And she's really built a wonderful relationship with many governors, both Democrat and Republican across the country, advocating for these good ideas. So I wanted her to come, one, because she's a tough interviewer, but two, because she's a young person that I think demonstrates a career path possibly for people, and also that I would like you to follow her on social media. She lives her life online to a certain degree, but she does it in a very civil way, while advocating for good ideas and making the case against bad ones as good as anyone I've seen in public life. So with that, I'll turn it over to you, Shoshana, to begin the session. And like every other session that we've had, if you've got a question along the way or you want to interject or say something, please just raise your hand at any time. We'll let Shoshana ask a few questions, but then feel free to make it a conversation.
Well, thank you so much. And so Governor Ducey is one of the people who will do me massive favors and act like I'm doing him a huge favor. He does this regularly. He's just an angel, which I will call him a perfect angel because he is, even when I disagree with him on policy. But I've worked with a lot of different elected officials, and most are pretty nice and down to earth and, you know, open to different policy ideas. But Governor Ducey is the only one who has criticized me for not criticizing him enough. I've taken flack from some elected officials for criticizing them too much, and they didn't like that I was criticizing them too much. We ended those relationships pretty quickly. But Governor Ducey is the only one who's like, you know, make sure you're not being yes all the time. Like, tell me when you disagree. And that's something you don't really see enough of. It happens, but it's something that I really value because you want that objectivity. You want the opportunity to change people's minds. But when I originally took notice of Governor Ducey, I think the first time was because he appointed Clint Bolick to the Arizona Supreme Court, who was a big licensing reform guy. He did some of the original cases about letting a guy, Eagle Brown, shine shoes on the street because DC didn't allow him to. And Ducey later enacted the first universal licensing recognition bill, which means people can work across state lines, move to Arizona, work, and that's a huge deal because that was the first time anyone implemented that. So I want to start by talking about that. A lot of licensing reform is really controversial, even though it's something that I more often than not really like. So how did you decide to say, hey, why can't people move here and work? Why don't I fix that? How did that start for you?
Well, first, I think it was with the campaign. It's very important to watch how people campaign. Often how they campaign is how they'll govern. And I was a bit naive. I've shared these stories with you in past sessions. When I did decide to run for office, I was from the private sector. I had never been to Washington, D.C. until I was 45 years old. And I thought, I grew up in Toledo, Ohio, and I had moved to Arizona to go to university, and then built my business there, found my wife, raised my family. And I just thought it was an incredible place to live in terms of quality of life. But our economy was very much construction and call center based. We did not have much diversity in the economy. We didn't have technology or all of the things that we have now, from autonomous vehicles to semiconductors and on and on. So I wanted to be the lead spokesperson and salesperson for the state. And it couldn't just be that our state has nicer weather than other states. You have to.
I've been there during the summer.
The summers can be tough, but you got to get to Flagstaff for the White Mountains. So it was really, I started my career at Procter & Gamble, and we were big on best practices. So I looked at other states that were growing and thriving and wanted to see what the policies were in those states. And I think there's some fundamentals, from lower taxes to lighter regulation to solid public K-12 education, affordable and accessible and reliable energy. Those are really the pillars. And then once you meet some of those standards, it's what happens beyond that. And also seeing how some of the special interests had colluded to slow down economic growth and development. And I think you recall we had a guy, Juan Carlos, who I think was fined or arrested for cutting hair down in Tucson for homeless people.
How dare he?
And we didn't think that was right. So we spoke out on that and changed some boards and commissions. And licensing was really something that flowed out of that mindset of allowing people to work. We were the fastest growing state, or among the top 3 fastest growing states in the country. And many of these people would pack up their U-Haul truck in Illinois and drive to Arizona, and they had a skill or a license that they could employ from where they left. But to do that in Arizona, they would have to go back to school or pay tuition to enter the workforce. And what we did on this was say that we were going to trust their government, that if they were accredited and seen as qualified and worthy to do this in the state from whence they came, that they could immediately begin working in the state of Arizona. We had to pass it through both chambers of the House and Senate. You probably remember better than I, but I think we did it by a broad majority, Democrats and Republicans. And now it's passed in how many other states?
We're going to be at 21 very soon, which is really exciting.
But Arizona was the first state in the nation to do this real common sense reform. And what I think is funny on this, and I always do want to hear the other side. And I had a great senior staff, and I would want somebody to make the case for and against every bill, so I could hear all the arguments. And the real argument against this idea was a Republican saying that if we do this in Arizona, what happens to the Arizonan who packs up a U-Haul truck and moves to Illinois and they're not allowed to work there? And I said, well, that's more Illinois' problem than it is Arizona's. So we did have a broad coalition. We had a huge signing ceremony, I think with a U-Haul truck in front of the state capitol. And now it's happened in other states. So to me, a lot of times when you're first or you're breakthrough, you take a bit of a political hit for getting that. This was something that was unique because it was not only good policy, it was good politics, and it's remained very popular.
So you've done a lot of stuff that I think other people were nervous to do or didn't think of. You were never afraid to be the first. And I think one of it's a niche thing that I don't think you talk about a lot, but it's one of my favorite things. And it's one of your first policies I learned about. I remember when Governor Ducey signed a law saying that the state government could no longer hire lobbyists to lobby itself. So rather than talk to one another, they were hiring lobbyists to go talk to their counterparts, which that's kind of ridiculous. They should be able to coordinate. And that's another thing that I don't think is quite partisan. But how did you learn that that was happening, that they were hiring lobbyists? Why did you decide maybe we don't do this?
Well, I want you to know that this happened. This is pre-2016. And this was us trying to move some things forward. And I know you all know your civics in here, and you know that there's 3 branches of government. But when you do get elected governor, you inherit these boards and commissions, and there's 220 of them. And they reside in the executive branch, and they're oftentimes working against your administration. And they have protection under the law in terms of the committee members, but not the lobbyists. So I thought if we're going to tangle with the folks that are sitting on the boards, that's one thing, and we can repopulate the boards over time due to statute, rule, or law, but we're not going to allow them to use taxpayer dollars to work against us. So I didn't think that state government should be in the business of employing lobbyists, and we let the lobbyists find other clients in the private sector.
Right. And I think that was another thing that I think people on both sides of the spectrum could kind of see, maybe this isn't just the best use of funding. What about with education reform too? Because you were early on that. It's become a big wave, much like the universal recognition.
Well, it would be hard for me to say what I think is the most consequential policy that we passed in 8 years. But the policy that took all of 8 years to pass was universal ESAs. And that is basically you getting your taxpayer dollars back from the government to decide on where you would like to be educated. And the money goes to the family. This was something that really animated me running for governor in 2014. And it was a very novel idea. No one had done this in the country at that time. And it took all of 8 years to get this done. It was something that was not popular. A lot of people my age and older have a real nostalgia for the neighborhood school that they grew up in. And I understand that, but things have changed dramatically in K-12 education. We also have a lot of great district K-12 schools that are already existing. So what I wanted to do was provide the kids that were trapped in school that was not progressing an option. And we were actually able to pass this in 2017. It was only with Republican votes. It was a much more targeted policy of 5,000 kids a year would get an ESA. And that would go on for 6 years. And I was actually okay with that policy because I know there's always unintended consequences on any law that you sign. And with that, we would have been able to build a constituency of 5,000 children a year and then have whatever reforms were necessary until it went universal. But one of the people that I think is worth reading and studying is Milton Friedman. And he said that the time for real change is in a crisis. And in that crisis, it's the ideas that are lying around that will be applied. And the crisis in my 7th year was COVID. And a lot of our superintendents misbehaved during COVID, along with the teachers union. And they shut these schools down somewhat unnecessarily after we got through the first wave and had a better understanding on who was vulnerable to this. And parents were very upset. In a state of emergency, governor has granted broad powers, and I put the ESA program into law optionally, and parents were able to send their kids off to school and get them in classrooms, because many of our charter schools, some of our public schools, and almost all of our religious schools were open. After that, we were able to pass a universal educational savings account. So not 5,000 kids a year, but every kid in the state of Arizona, I think over 2 million children are eligible for this. And it's off to a big start. I think 60 or 70,000 families have signed up already. So very hopeful for what's possible here. And now it's passed in Iowa, Utah. It's about to pass in Florida, Texas, and West Virginia, and I think maybe another state or two.
So in the COVID era too, I think that there was a lot of opportunity for reform. And I remember at one point you were almost ad-libbing it. You're like, I'm going to expand telehealth for dogs, which was actually a thing he did, which was great. And I'm like, yeah, like, why not? Like, if you can treat your dog virtually, like, there's no reason not to. But it was just so funny to watch you ad-libbing through it, realizing, you know, you were taking on the opportunity to show through data after, you know, because these wouldn't last forever because they were executive orders and emergency orders, but they were opportunities to show, hey, you can do this and it's safe. There's data now showing it's safe. And a lot of states did stuff like this, but I think you really took more opportunity. There were some states that did telehealth for dogs besides Arizona, but you were one of few. And I think if I recall correctly, Arizona is trying to pass that now, making it so you don't have to have, I know it might sound silly to some of you, you don't have to have a pre-existing relationship with the dog or other pet and your veterinarian, which is a thing in telehealth where you often can't do telehealth unless you've done it in person with a doctor, which I'm not totally sure always makes sense, maybe in certain cases, but that's also a thing for veterinary telehealth, and they're trying to get that through. So how were you able to leverage the crisis to be able to make people's lives better and save lives in certain cases by allowing people to see their doctors online? How did you, like, from a governing strategy, how were you thinking about what you were going to tackle there?
Everything during COVID was a challenge. And I know there's a lot of opinions on how it was handled, both at the state level and at the federal level. But I do think in the beginning, because nobody really knew exactly what the situation was, the fact that states could make their own decisions was the right way to handle it. And I was leading the Republican Governors Association at the time. We were holding a conference call twice a week at the time, and nearly every governor was on that, along with the National Governors Association conference call. And I remember about April, it was late February or March when COVID really, the alarm bell started ringing nationally, and the 15 days to slow the spread that was then turned into 30. And Charlie Baker, who was the governor of Massachusetts, called me up in April. And he said, thank you for hosting these conference calls. They are really helpful to me. I don't know how you have the time to do this and moderate these, because I can't be on them all. But thank you. And I said, well, I mean, thank you, Charlie. You're participating, and with what you're going through right now, I think we're all learning a lot. And he said, I just want to ask you a question. He said, do you know more people whose small businesses have been affected by COVID, or do you know more people that have died of COVID? I said, Charlie, I don't know anybody that has COVID. Okay, COVID hadn't come to Arizona yet. That doesn't mean it wasn't there in a case or two, but our weather was very cool. In the springtime, everyone's outside, and it was the Eastern Seaboard. It was Andrew Cuomo in Massachusetts and those states that were really in the bureau. Now that all changed in June when everybody came inside, but the measures that Charlie Baker and Andrew Cuomo and Phil Murphy were doing were the ones they thought were best for their states in that situation. And then I was able to do that and actually prepare ahead, knowing that this was likely going to come when everyone came inside, when the temperature hit triple digits. So along the way, there was a lot of discussion of how do we prepare for this and how can we make life safer and easier for people, because it was, before it was completely politicized, if you remember, there was just a lot of fear of the unknown. Now, there were some things that we came up with, which I think were unique ideas and widely popular, like alcohol to go. And the reason we came up with that idea is people were not going to restaurants. And restaurateurs had service workers and of course rent to pay. But a lot of them figured out the to-go business, the delivery business. And if you think about it, we were not encouraging drinking and driving. We were encouraging someone that could do a one-stop shop and also get what they wanted to have in terms of refreshments as well and go home. And many of our restaurants really thrived through that period. But that began more of a process of what other things are in rule or in custom that could be easier on folks. And I think telehealth is one of the best examples. If you think about it, when you're not feeling well, you go to a doctor's office and sit in a room with other people that are not feeling well. And oftentimes, unless it's something that's at the emergency level, it's something that you need a prescription for, or maybe you're going to be sent to Walgreens or CVS to find something that's off the shelf. So we started the telehealth, and it made life easier. It kept people from spreading the coronavirus in these waiting rooms. But it was really the stories of the moms that had to travel with sick children to places like Phoenix Children's Hospital. And they were able to have these appointments online. And I think sometimes you think that the people that are going to your hospitals all live in the near vicinity, but it really is a burden on the moms and dads that live in rural Arizona or prefer Phoenix Children's Hospital, but live in Tucson. And all of a sudden they had access to the best healthcare facilities in the state with great ease. Not every appointment can be done with telehealth, but a lot of them can. It's easier on the doctor, it's better for the patient, and it's lower cost. So it's something, those were the ideas that we moved forward. And there's oftentimes some special interest out there that want to stop some of those because they benefit financially or otherwise. And I think the idea of around doing it for pets and others is also a way to socialize with the electorate, because oftentimes state legislators sometimes won't be as courageous as you want them to be when you're making change. You can do a lot of things by executive order, but that isn't really that good in the end, because you know that the crisis is going to end and you're going to have to pass these things statutorily. And that's what we work towards.
So I have more questions, but if anyone else wants to jump in, feel free to raise your hand. Yeah, go ahead.
So thank you for coming today, by the way. I was actually in Phoenix this past weekend on a flight layover, and something that I saw in the great airport, by the way.
Isn't it? Yeah. It really is.
All the restaurants, a lot of them were local restaurants.
Yes.
Which is something that you don't really see often in a lot of airports. So what I wanted to ask is, how can we get other states and other airports to promote these small businesses? Because it was great. But yeah.
Well, thank you. I agree with you. I travel a lot. I've traveled a lot in my past life and in this life. And I do think we're very lucky to have Sky Harbor. It's really right in the heart of town. So it's a quick commute to anywhere. And that of course predated my administration, but there was a focus on bringing in better food, especially post 9/11, where people had to get to the airport earlier, get through security. And somehow over the course of time, that's credit that I've got to give to the city of Phoenix and the municipality of Maricopa County. They, I think, saw some of that happening in some other airports around the country, and almost every concept, and there's dozens of concepts that are available when you get beyond the gate, are local concepts and moderately priced and diverse business ownership. So I think that's something that's more at the local level. I would have loved to, of course, everybody wants to be in charge of different things, but there's a reason that we have federalism and local control. That was not something under the purview of the governor, but the credit belongs elsewhere. Yes.
I have a question about the whole licensing debacle. What was
Did
the
you say
argument?
debacle?
Yeah, like the whole issue. What was the argument made against your policy? Was it like license granting institutions that were against, or was there like a pro in-state labor argument?
Oftentimes the arguments are really by the entrenched special interest. That's why I said that there's unintended consequences when you pass one of these laws, because sometimes it benefits a smaller group of individuals or protects them, and they do not want to expand it. One of the things that benefited me in passing this universal licensing recognition is before that, we passed universal recognition for military spouses. Everybody loves, or by and large, everybody loves military spouses. Military spouses have to relocate on average every 18 months. And in the military, because oftentimes there's a trailing spouse, this would cause real unrest in the household. It would cause divorce, and it would cause loss of income because the spouse just doesn't want to get recertified to be a grade school teacher. They were held in good standing in the state in which they came, yet in the new state, they've got to go back to school for whatever amount of time. So we began with that, and it made sense for military spouses. It was very popular. We had a lot of the spouses coming and testifying that this was good policy for me. Well, why should we only do that for military spouses? Why wouldn't any American have that same option when they have a skill and they've relocated? So I think sometimes it's softening the ground or making the case. I mean, I know our system can be frustrating, but when we do that for a class that's immensely popular and people immediately get it, it helps you get the bigger reform of the universal recognition, and then it goes from state to state. I can't tell you how this regime was set up before me, because I just came into office in 2015. It was the idea of how do we reduce these barriers that allow enterprise to flow, if that makes sense. I couldn't make the argument for the other side because obviously they couldn't make it to stop us.
I can make the argument a little. Stephanie
Yeah.
might be a little hesitant to say, like, what I found is so sometimes the boards are okay because they're getting more members. They're like, cool, we get to regulate more people, which makes sense. But then the industries are like, we're gonna have more competition. And I know it sounds funny to say, like, no one's that cynical. But I mean, when you doctors often try to stop letting other doctors come into their state, they don't often like telehealth because they're like, wait, I compete with that doctor in another state now. And it's really sad. The doctors, and I like doctors. I have a lot. I have a lot of diseases, very poor health. It's fine. It's just a lot of autoimmune diseases, and it takes a lot of doctors to figure it out sometimes. So I have some great ones, but the doctors lobby against letting nurses do more. The nurses, unfortunately, then sometimes lobby against letting pharmacists do more, and in very small measured ways. But you'll see this, everyone from them down to florists, which are only licensed in Louisiana, has made the case, if you stop licensing florists, all havoc will break loose, which it's nuts, but it's real arguments that they'll make. And one last example is in actually Arizona, when you guys de-license hair blow drying, which is licensed in almost every state. Literally just blow dry to someone's hair. If there's money exchanged, you're doing something illegal. So dry bars wanted reform, and you had this one cosmetologist come up and say, well, if you reduce licensing here and get rid of licensing just for hair blow dryers, then immigrants will blow dry your hair. Do you want that? And I'm like, that's not an argument for health or safety, but it's not unusual to say, oh, we'll have unfair competition from people from other countries or other places. It's not to say there aren't legitimate and lines of thinking where they're concerned, But a lot of times it is that sheer protectionism, sometimes thinly veiled in public safety.
Thanks for coming back. Question I had was about, I think last time you were talking about bipartisanship and how you had people from all over helping in commissions and whatnot. So how has bipartisan affected achieving these goals?
Well, I'm trying to remember the context of the discussion, because I do think that a good idea should be able to be presented in nearly any room in a state. And I would very rarely label an idea conservative and certainly not Republican, because you want to persuade people on the efficacy of the idea. I think when you're talking about these ideas, the military has, Republicans, Democrats, independents, and unaffiliated. I think we talk about the school reform, which was the largest reform likely in the history of the state, and the first in the United States. This was actually gotten over the line by Janelle Woods, who was the chairman of the Black Mothers Forum, along with the Black pastors of Arizona. Not one of them a registered Republican. So to me, it's more the powers in the idea, and then how you persuade and communicate around the idea that built a broad bipartisan buy-in to it. Now, unfortunately, I was rarely able to get that buy-in inside our legislature, except on universal licensing. With all the help from the African-American pastors, all Democrats, we still did not secure one Democratic vote. And that's the power of the government unions, the teachers union specifically.
Were there actually, on the bipartisanship note, were there dynamics where you were able to find, you knew you could find, or you knew you couldn't find bipartisanship, whether it's of how you spoke to them or efforts of where the idea came from? Were there ways that you could predict we'll probably be able to get their support versus we probably won't?
When the legislature was stuck, when you're coming towards the end of the session, that's where some more deal making can happen. And I also want to say in Arizona, which I had a record that was considered reliably read and lauded in many of the center-right organizations, 92% of the legislation I signed was bipartisan. But there are some of the more hot button issues where it falls down to where it's more tribal.
We've talked a lot about having data and evidence, and obviously COVID was a constantly switching.
Yes.
And you have a positive. At the end of the day, Arizona had a very high death rate. I think the highest in the nation, 100,000, and relatively low vaccination rate, probably connected. How did that affect the policies going forward?
Well, I think it was more the policies that we put forward to begin with. We prioritized lives in Arizona, along with some attention to livelihoods and individual liberties. And I would actually leave this argument to Dr. Richard Carmona, who was the Surgeon General in a Democratic administration. And he wrote the piece on observation of the policies that were put forward in the state of Arizona. A lot of dynamics in the state of Arizona in terms of we are a state with many elderly to begin with. The first executive order that I did was on March 11th, and it was to protect people inside of our nursing homes. Yet we have a large cohort that's 75 years and older, in Sun City and our western suburbs. I think that along with other issues combined in terms of what the results were, but I don't think there's any state that could point, my thing during COVID was to make the best possible decisions for Arizona and to stay out of the national politics of COVID. I didn't pass judgment on any other governor and the decisions that they made. I did what I think was in the best interest of the people of Arizona with protecting the cohort that we knew that was most vulnerable. And that was folks 65 and older with an underlying health condition. And I think if you look at how Arizona navigated through the crisis and then came out of the crisis, the results would speak to the policy. But I'll leave the medical commentary to the experts.
All right, then I want to talk budget reform.
Yes.
So I know I said it a little too excitedly, but no, I feel like a lot of conservatives these days just aren't as interested in budget reform. They've kind of moved on from balancing a budget, stuff like that, 10 years ago, everyone was like, balanced budget amendment and all that kind of stuff. What made that a priority for you and how did you execute it?
Well, like I said, I came from the private sector, and all of you have to balance your budget. All of your parents have to balance their budget. And every small business, which is what I was, a small businessman, had to balance their budget. And I just couldn't believe the way that our state had navigated post downturn. And we had about $1 billion deficit, and I ran as a business person who could balance the budget. And we inherited a $1 billion deficit. It wasn't easy to balance that budget in the first year, but I'll tell you a little secret in how we did it. We spent less money than we had coming in. And all of a sudden your budget is balanced. So you have to make some really tough decisions when you do some things like that. And for whatever reason, you do take a popularity hit when you do that. But I saw it as the responsibility of the position as chief executive officer. Now I had to get the votes to do that. And a lot of Republicans did not want to sign on to a budget that they saw as unpopular. So some of the things that I learned from being in the private sector and running for office, there's something called the yellow sheet in Arizona. And when somebody says something about the governor in Arizona in public, it's written up in the yellow sheet. So with the Republicans that wouldn't sign my budget, I said, here's what I want you to do. When you go out to LD 18 and they're mad about the budget, I want you to blame me, okay? I will own this budget. And next year at this time, our revenues will be better and we'll be able to target investment and we'll have more spending. Or the economy won't be better and we'll be even happier that we made these tough decisions now. But it was the shortest session in the history of the state of Arizona. We balanced the budget. People were upset. The papers wrote bad editorials and the revenues were better the next year. And we were able to spend additional money while cutting or simplifying taxes every year and leave the state with a $5.2 billion surplus.
So I don't think there's any other current governors in the room. I'm sorry if there are, and I didn't know, but there might be future governors. You never know. What would your advice be to future governors, current governors who maybe are on the fence about if they want to tackle the budget and balance it and how to do it?
Well, one, I think it's the job of the governor to tackle the budget. I mean, that's what you do every year. That's the one thing besides showing up the second Monday of January and giving the state of the state, you have to deliver a budget by June 30th or the state shuts down in most states. I know that's how it is in Arizona. So I think to have a plan is something that people want to know during the campaign. That's why I always watch how somebody does campaign. If you want a hint as to how they'll govern, it usually is how they will campaign. And you know, it's really something I think right now that's sad is we don't have a lot of these types of discussions on the campaign trail. Candidates are put in a position where they have to answer all sorts of trick questions that navigate them through the primary. And very rarely, if ever, are you asked a question about the budget on the campaign trail.
Is that new or has it always been the case?
Well, I still feel somewhat new, even though I'm termed out after 8 years. But I wasn't in politics as a young person, but I do think each election cycle brings its own issues that are on the mind of the base and then the mind of the general public. But the budget is a constant. I mean, if you think about it, the core of the job of being governor, you are the chief executive of the state government. And our state government had a combined budget of $40 billion, 35,000 plus employees, 220 boards and commissions, and 47 agencies that report directly to the governor. And no one asks a question about that on the campaign trail. But that's the fundamental core of the job, and then all the other cool things you can do as governor.
Any other questions?
So as governor of a state that tends to have very low education spending per capita, how do you tackle the dilemma between people, of course, not wanting their taxes to be higher and also balancing a state budget while also dealing with the teacher crisis and education funding shortage?
So I want to push back a little bit on the myth of our education funding. We put 11.4 billion additional dollars into K-12 education over the 8 years I was in office. That's more than any other state in the nation. Today, for a student in Arizona at the completion of last year's budget, it was $15,656 per student in terms of education investment. But I want to point out a larger issue here. In what other organization in the country or in the world do you measure success by the amount of spending? Spending in K-12 education in America, inflation adjusted over the past 15 years has tripled, yet our results have flatlined. I think we should have more of a discussion around the outcomes and results around K-12 education. And I'm all for, we not only spent that 11.4 billion additional, invested it, we solved the constitutional crisis through something called Prop 123. They put 3.5 billion additional dollars out of our permanent land endowment trust fund. We mandated a 20% teacher pay raise along the way. All of it rolled up to that 11.4 billion additional dollars. And I do think Arizona can demonstrate results in terms of leading the country in improvement in math and reading. And that would be what I brag on, not about spending more than anyone else in the country over the course of my 8 years. And if you look at the states where the spending is the highest, or let's say the cities where the spending is the highest, I think you'd find Baltimore, Maryland, Detroit, Michigan, Washington, DC, and Chicago, Illinois. So those must be the finest K-12 districts in the country, except they're not. They're bottom of the barrel.
I wanted to ask about your opinions of the Republican Party at large now. You talk a lot about bipartisanship and getting 92% of the bills you signed were bipartisan. But in 2022, we saw specifically in Arizona, we saw two candidates in Kerry Lake and Lake Masters who I don't think would have governed or legislated in the same way you did. So what is your...
That's a question of speech because neither of them will legislate or govern. No, keep going. It's a good question. No. So you just commentary on that?
Yeah, what do you...
Well, I'd say if you were talking the Republican Party writ large, and really the cause I believe in is the conservative cause, meaning things emanate from the Declaration and the Constitution, and maintaining those things. So there's a role for a governor, there's a role for a state government, and there's also a role for what happens on the federal level. And that's something I'd like to see a renewal of. I think in this town, most people think they rule the world. Once they get here, they think it should be a top-down, one-size-fits-all. I think if we allowed states to experiment and innovate, like Justice Louis Brandeis talked about in the laboratories of democracy, we'd find better policies and we'd be able to move things forward. But speaking politically on what happened in the 2022 cycle, any candidate that was looking forward and talking about the future of their office was elected. Anyone that was looking backwards and talking about what happened in the previous election lost. And I think that if you are going to run on the Republican side of the aisle, you ought to turn the page on 2020. You ought to focus on what's important to your constituents, and you should make the case on what you would do if you were given that responsibility and how you would be better in contrast to your opponent. And that's, you didn't see or hear any of that in the last election cycle. I think that's true pretty much around the country. Yeah. Go ahead.
What do you think about the people that the current candidates for the 2024 Republican primary and the ones that haven't announced yet, but there's a lot of rumors about them announcing.
So I think that we've been on the conservative side of the aisle. We've been fighting the left for decades. We're getting ready for an inter-party fight. It's overdue. Let it come. So it's still early. You hear people are rumored to be throwing their hat in the ring. I think today we only have 2 announced candidates. Is that accurate? We have 3 now?
Oh, yeah.
No, I think we have Donald Trump and Nikki Haley.
And we
Oh, yes, okay, yes, yes, we have. So let's let the field form. I think it's going to be important to get folks on a stage in a forum setting and in debate settings. And let's see what our options are. But I think it's time to turn the page on the past and to see what's next. Yes.
What do you think was your most difficult policy battle while you were in office, and how did that inform your governing experience as the governor of Arizona?
So the toughest time for me as governor beyond COVID was there were out-of-state interests that came. In Arizona, it's an anomaly of our constitution where you can have an initiative process. So anything you want on the ballot, if you have enough money from anywhere in this country, and you can get enough signatures, you can get that on the ballot. And it was something called Prop 208. And it was to take our income tax. Now, I ran on getting the income tax as close to zero as possible. They wanted to take our 4.5% income tax and take it to 8%. And the proposition to the people was, how would you like to put an additional $1 billion into K-12 education, but it won't cost you a dime? Because this only fell on the top earners in the state. So it was a small cohort of people. Now, 8% income tax is equivalent to New York State, which people are fleeing, Washington, D.C., which
We're in.
you are in, and Bernie Sanders, Vermont. I thought it would be a millstone around the state's economy that would metastasize over the course of a decade. It was polled very high, and it was in the 2020 cycle. So there was all kinds of cross currents. It was nearly impossible to get on television. Arizona was considered a swing state. Donald Trump had bought up all the advertising. Joe Biden bought up the other part of the advertising. Mark Kelly and Martha McSally were. So we had a tough time communicating to people on why this wasn't a good idea and the amount of investment we had made in K-12 education. So it was polling at 65-35. But we got in the fight, and it may not have been winnable. And we knew that, and it was brutal, like a slog. You know, in most of my races, especially in my personal races, I could see a light at the end of the tunnel. And I thought, if we can get there, we'll get over the finish line first. On this one, I never had real confidence that we could defeat it, but we had to fight it. We lost that battle 51-49. That gave us the courage with our legislature to have some tax reform that we were able to do in that next legislative session. And we challenged the initiative because we thought it was written with deceptive language. It said basically something like, when you go from 4.5% to 8%, I believe that's a 77% increase. I studied finance, and that's how the math works. They communicated it as a 3.5% surcharge. We challenged it. It went to the Supreme Court. At the same time, we reduced taxes with our surplus. And at the end of the day, our Supreme Court struck the initiative down. So we took our tax code from 4.5% to 2%, the lowest flat tax in the nation. But it took 18 months to do it, and it was 18 months of pain and agony. If you've ever seen the show Wide World of Sports, it used to lead off with this guy coming down a ski jump and says the agony of defeat. Well, we suffered the agony of defeat for 18 months. And then when the Supreme Court ruling came along with the legislative fix, it was the thrill of victory. So I would say the lesson there is persistence. I think we were certainly mocked by the press and by our opponents, and even by many of our funders who thought that we had lost that battle. But eventually we did win it. And it can be tough to be in the public square and to keep grinding on something that, when I would explain to people, here's what we're doing legislatively, and here's what we believe the case is, that the courts will see our way. People rolled their eyes. They thought we were filibustering. But at the end of the day, we were right, we were persistent, and I would also say there's, in anything really good in this business, there's some luck involved. And I felt we got all three of them.
So one more for me, where do your best ideas come from? The ones you're most.
Besides you?
Besides me, I know most of them are me, but second.
I want to say I had a great senior staff. I do think when you get the governor's job, you're really in the people selection business. It's a big job in any state. And no one person, no matter how talented they are, could do it on their own. And who you select as your chief of staff, as your deputy, as your policy advisor, makes a huge difference. And I think you've seen the success of my team, the things that they've gone on to do in the policy world. And they knew that I ran on action-oriented agenda. I think that's important as well. We had a roadmap for the future of the state of Arizona. We wanted to get everything done in that book. We also had a pledge to the people of Arizona, and we wanted to stay true to each of those commitments. And then we said, what other states are doing things better than us? And I used to go to all the National Governors Association meetings and the RGA meetings, and I'd have a yellow legal pad. And every time I saw somebody doing something I thought was a good idea or better than what we were doing, I would pass it out to my team and say, there's more on your to-do list. Let's get these things going. Let's find champions for these ideas. And I think we spent 3 or 4 years doing that. And then I'd like to think in our last term, we were more of an exporter of the best ideas, the American Civics Act, universal licensing, telehealth, universal school choice. Those are things Arizona was a first in. But I do think having the necessary humility that other states can do things better. And there is really, I think governor's the best job in politics. It's governors are very collegial by and large. They communicate. Nearly every governor in the country has my cell phone and vice versa. But at the end of the day, we're competitive. We want to beat our other states on whatever issue it is. So we'd say sometimes if we see a good idea elsewhere, we bring it back to Arizona, sometimes with attribution, sometimes without. But I do think that is something that's unique. Governors are one of really the only caucuses that still meet together and have those kind of relationships. And I may not agree with one thing Gavin Newsom is doing in policy, but if there's a wildfire in California, our firefighters go to California, and he's very generous when we have the same thing in Arizona. So I think that's unique. It's kind of how it used to be. I think it's important that we do that again. But so I would say it's really looking across the landscape, and then also challenging your team of, hey, what can we do better? What can we do different? And there are a lot of good organizations. Part of the reason I wanted to bring you in, Senator, is so the young people could see the different places where they could intern or have a career path, whether it's center right, center left, or nonpartisan.
I have a question for both of you guys. I've been talking to students on campus on both sides of the spectrum politically, and they say, sometimes they feel like they can't express their opinion or thoughts in class, but they want to be exposed to diversity of thought. They want to be exposed to people on the left and people on the right. And so I'm like, oh, wow. But then seeing what happened last week when the Federalist Society tried to have an event at Stanford Law School and the students completely shut it down was really disheartening and concerning, because it's like we forgot what free speech means. And I'm just wondering, how do you guys think students and Gen Zers should promote and can promote civil discourse on campus, and just like not seeing each other as just, you know, our political ideologies, but having conversations around these things.
Sure, I'll start. So I worked with everyone from literally Elizabeth Warren to Governor Ducey to Tom Cotton, everyone all over the spectrum. Elizabeth Warren like licensing reform, so I'm like, cool, let's do that together. I don't think I agree with her on like anything else, but I'm like, if we're gonna agree on something, let's nerd together. And I think, I mean, it sounds cliche, but we genuinely have more in common than we do different. There's a Colorado representative who also loves licensing reform and has a pugs, and I love pugs. So we've made friends, and he's just really down to earth and really eager to do good work. And a lot of people will, I mean, not everyone's going to agree on all categories, but a lot of people want more economic innovation. Like they're like, yeah, let's let the economy do more, let people do more. And I think it's worth it for students to take a look at different politicians who are doing something that they're surprised by. Like, oh, wait, I didn't expect that this one would do this, and check into it a little bit more and maybe invite them to campus for a speech. Especially like there's the, like Sununu, I think is fairly pro-choice, and that's a little out of the ordinary. And Republicans and Democrats agree and disagree on how to regulate tech. There's so many weird cuts these days, which I think is really great. Even if I disagree with it, it makes me mad sometimes. I think it's good for people to be able to work together. And if you go looking for it, you'll see it. It's hard in the classroom sometimes. Like I've had professors that didn't like me because I leaned right and I was more boisterous. Not that I'm not now, but different kind of boisterous at the time. But I've also had liberal professors who were so great and so like, yeah, you're into this, like go to this meeting, go to this thing. The last thing I'll say too is think tanks are a really great place. If you go to think tank events and ask them well thought out questions, not questions to hear yourself talk, but questions which happen a lot of think tanks from many grown adults, and it's like not great and it happens a lot. But there's tons of opportunity for it. I think the Stanford thing also just disappointed me personally the most, just because like these are future lawyers who are going to defend and have to argue before these judges. They should be taking that as a challenge to say, how can I tweak this judge's mind? How can I learn from this judge so that if I'm arguing before this judge, I'll know just what to say, because you never know when that comes back. And I think it's super important for that. And also for Republicans to work with the American Constitution Society, for Democrats to go to Federalist Society events. I like that. I think that's really healthy. So to reach out and, you know, see where people are open and try to talk their language a little bit. Don't use words that'll turn them off. Don't say, oh, I have a great Republican idea, why don't you support it? But be like, hey, would you agree on this? Maybe we can, you know, just be chill and maybe even feather light sugar coating, but then you can be a little bit more real over time. So there's real opportunity. It's just the people who desire it have to go far out of their way sometimes, which is unfortunate.
I'm not really sure. I think it's very unfortunate. It was not my experience as a young person. Very few people, if anyone, identified by party. Many of us were, I think, developing our political philosophy in school. Of course, there was a young Republican and young Democrats on campus. I didn't participate in those organizations, and I see what's going on in some of these different settings. I think it's fixable. I would really encourage you to have a broad and diverse media diet. Please find some people that think differently than you. And I sometimes would have people come in my office and CNN or MSNBC would be on. And people would say, well, why are you watching that? And I said, well, I'm preparing for the press. I'm going to be in front of them. And it really is a good way to prepare for the press. It shows the issues that are on most of the reporters' minds. And but I think the idea of hearing the other side, finding out maybe where your arguments are weak, maybe learning where there is a point where you can find some common ground is good policy. And I just think, and it might be my Midwestern sensibilities of just being polite and civil. Also, I remember walking home from, my grade school, Blessed Sacrament, and stopping for, refreshments or sandwiches on the way home. And there were a lot of homes in my neighborhood that had pictures of the Pope and John F. Kennedy hanging on the wall. So I imagine these folks were Democrats. But again, I grew up in a time where if you asked my aunt Judy who she voted for, she'd say it's none of your business. And I know that's changed. I think it's good that we have discussion around politics, but I don't think anybody should be shouted down in these settings. And I think it's a real shame to see it happening on these college campuses and places that were once considered bastions of innovative thought and free speech. Yes. Oh, okay, yes.
I have a quick comment about that. Firstly, if you like interviewing conservatives for that project, you should tell them to have more courage. Because like the thing is that I'm a conservative and like some guys, like some libs won't like you when speaking in class. But here at AU, you know, the most liberal university in the country, I've said some comments in class and I've had like people after class approach me. And I've had professors who portray themselves in a very liberal manner talk to me after class and be like, fantastic. Like, there's going to be cases of like people that are not great, not very open, but most people are really open. I've had professors I like debated with in class and they gave me 100% of my essays. But yeah, back to the question. You alluded to the idea that personnel is policy, and there's like 1,000 conservative organizations in DC now that all have that mission. They're like, we want to like hire good personnel and blah, blah, blah. When it comes to like being governor in Arizona, how does that process work? Like, are there organizations that come up to you and say like, these are 100 people that you should hire? Like, do you interview them? Like, what do you do?
So it is kind of amazing when you run for office and the amount of high quality young people you get introduced to along the way. First, you have to find some people that really believe in you and believe in your campaign. I was very fortunate that my first hire was Sarah Muller. She was a 23-year-old recent grad of Washington and Lee University that had really thought through some of these issues. And, you know, she was my driver, treasurer, campaign manager, and body man on my first election. I had an open door with Senator John Kyle, who thought highly of me, and having access to his circle of advisors was a way to get good people put in front of me. I would say, you know, I've said this at the last ones, if you guys ever want to serve an elective office, I encourage you to get a job outside of politics, build a business, turn a school around, join the military. Do something where you have some subject matter expertise and you can develop leadership and communication skills. And then run for office in the second part of your life. Not everybody listens to that. They're more ambitious and eager. The other thing that I would say is the way you get good at making people selection decisions is by making people selection decisions. And I made a lot of mistakes early in my career. Now, I was not perfect, far from it as governor, but I had a lot of good people selection, understanding, you know, where someone should be, what their role should be, what the goal of the organization, how to communicate that across a large state government out of a state capital. Those were all things I learned by trial and experience over the 25 years of working and leading and managing along the way. The other thing I would say, you are in the belly of the beast here. All roads used to run through Rome. Now they run through Washington, D.C. I think you would be surprised at the flexibility and latitude you would have if you would get out of D.C. and go to whatever state you want and try to get a job in a governor's office. And before you get a job in a governor's office, I would really highly encourage you to find a candidate that you believe in and work on that campaign. One, you'll learn a ton. You'll really get to know the candidate, and hopefully they're successful. But if you do a good job on that campaign, when we won our primary, and we had a very competitive primary, I think 12 or 14 other candidates in 2014, we hired the best people that we saw from other campaigns onto our team. So you don't just have to pick the winner. You go out there and you do the best possible job. And I think those are the people that have been most successful in politics, from Sarah Muller to Kirk Adams to Gretchen Conger to Daniel Scarpinato and Daniel Ruiz. Were all people that followed some of that same path. So you know them by experience and by reputation. And then there's just a lot of flexibility. I mean, it's hard doing this. It's fun, and it is really consuming to be inside an administration. And you don't really realize it until you're out of the administration or the administration's over. But it's very worthy work, and there's all kinds of pathways. But I'd encourage you to just to at least look at other opportunities outside of this large corporate government here. Now, Shoshana, do you have any closing comments?
No, I mean, it's a pleasure to be able to do this. This is actually the third time I've gotten to interview you. The first time in 2017 when we talked licensing reform, second time in 2019 when we talked licensing reform. It's nice to be able to talk more about your career broadly. I'd also say it's worth looking through his record if you're interested in how governors work best, because I don't know anyone who's had a better team or a more rigorous work environment that was focused on results and focused on staff being able to challenge him and know that. There's a lot of politicians who want yes men, who don't want to be challenged and who just want to do what they off the cuff think. And he's the opposite of that. So I'd suggest if you're interested in working for elected officials or going that route, look through his record, learn more about it, and then find other elected officials who you think are doing a good job and watch their patterns, figure out what they're doing, which media they are and aren't talking to, and how they handle their public persona as well as like their legislative one. So that's my big advice here.
Thank you. Thanks very much for making time in your day. I want to thank everyone for being here. And I guess close just with a couple thoughts. One thing I like about this fellowship is that we talk a lot about policy, but we also talk about the politics. You know, there really aren't silver medals in this business for second place. You have to win the office to move the policy forward. And I think the opportunity you have in this institute and in this chosen course of study is to really experiment and look around at all the different options. I always get in trouble when I start dropping names in these things because I've been able to work with so many good people, but some people find they have a real heart for the political side of the business. Some people have a real heart for the policy side of the business. Sometimes there's crossover. For example, Danny Siden, who worked on my campaign in 2014, now leads the Arizona Chamber of Commerce.